What if your quiet disappearance isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough? Most people assume silence means something is wrong, that someone has given up. But what if your withdrawal from certain people, places, and patterns is not a collapse, but a sacred shift, a slow and invisible rising? As your consciousness evolves, the noise of unconscious environments begins to sting. You begin to feel it in your chest, in your breath, in the space between words at a dinner table. You look around and suddenly see how much of your life has been built on pleasing others, reading the room, pretending to care. And now, you can't fake it anymore. This is not rebellion, it is a revelation. The truth is, staying in certain rooms begins to feel like self-betrayal. You sense it the moment you smile when something in you wants to frown. You feel it when you nod in agreement to avoid conflict, even though your soul screams in silence. The body knows, and one day, the ache of staying becomes louder than the fear of leaving. So you stop explaining. You don't announce a grand exit. You begin to drift, quietly, respectfully, without drama. You don't ghost people out of cruelty. You simply can't keep ghosting yourself. Carl Jung spoke of this sacred turning inward as the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beneath the masks and performances. At first it feels lonely, but over time, the loneliness becomes spaciousness. The solitude becomes healing. You realize that peace is not something others grant you through their approval. It's something you reclaim when you stop abandoning your own soul to keep others comfortable. You disappear because something deeper is appearing. You disappear not to hide, but to see clearly, not to punish, but to preserve, not to end relationships, but to end the old version of you that was built on self-forgetting. This withdrawal is not a weakness, it's wisdom, a wisdom that many over 35 come to know. When the roles no longer fit, when the noise becomes unbearable, when the soul whispers, "It's time." So ask yourself, what are you still attending out of habit, not harmony? What parts of you are waiting to be reclaimed in silence? Maybe your quiet disappearance isn't the end of the story, but the sacred beginning of one only you were meant to write. What if what you call news is actually a mirror, and the outrage you feel is not entirely your own? Let's be honest. Have you noticed how emotionally exhausted you become after scrolling through endless political arguments, moral outrage, and collective indignation? It doesn't matter which side you're on. The energy is the same, tense, divisive, inflamed. At some point, it stops feeling like a righteous cause and starts to feel like psychological warfare on your nervous system, your peace, your humanity. But why is it so hard to walk away from it? Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." What if much of the rage, blame, and criticism we see online is not truth-telling, but projection? A massive unconscious purge of our disowned shadows, our own denied fear, powerlessness, shame, and hatred, flung outward at politicians, strangers, celebrities, or anyone who seems wrong enough to carry our pain? This is what Jung called the collective shadow, the hidden, unacknowledged aspects of society's psyche. And once you truly see it, not just intellectually but viscerally, it becomes impossible to participate in the game. You start to notice the pattern. Every news cycle needs a villain. Every public debate is more about emotional discharge than meaningful change. The truth gets buried under performance, and outrage becomes a drug people use to avoid their own emptiness. But here's the deeper cost. Your soul begins to ache. People over 35 often feel this first. The need to protect their energy becomes urgent. not because they've stopped caring about the world, but because they realize they cannot save it by joining the chaos. They understand that healing does not come from winning arguments, but from breaking cycles, from refusing to keep bleeding into broken systems, from stepping back quietly and tending to the only space they actually have power over, their own inner world. It's not easy to detach. You may feel guilty for not engaging, as if silence equals apathy. But Jung reminds us, the real transformation happens in the individual, not in mobs, not in wars of opinion, but in the solitude of a person brave enough to face their own darkness without projecting it outward. So, you unplug. You stop responding. You lose the appetite for outrage, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've started healing. And in that silence, clarity returns, peace returns. You return. What if the bravest thing you can do for the collective is not to scream louder, but to become so inwardly clear, so whole, that your very presence is the protest? Let's ask ourselves, when was the last time you paused before reacting? Can you sense the difference between your true values and your triggered emotions? And what would happen if, just for a day, you stopped watching the shadows on the wall and turned inward to meet the one behind the projection? Sometimes the most revolutionary act is to heal yourself quietly while the world spins in noise. What if the exhaustion you feel isn't laziness, weakness, or aging, but a deep internal alarm telling you that your soul can no longer carry what it once tolerated? There comes a point when your body starts saying what your mind has been trying to suppress. The tension in your chest, the racing thoughts before sleep, the sudden overwhelm in crowded rooms or loud conversations. You're not just tired, you're energetically overdrawn, and no amount of coffee, yoga, or willpower seems to replenish the tank. Why? Because the true cause isn't physical, it's psychological, it's spiritual. It's what Carl Jung would call the unconscious labor of staying awake in a sleeping world. When you begin to see clearly, when you've awakened to your own patterns, traumas, projections, and boundaries, you cannot unsee. But what most people don't realize is that with this awareness comes an invisible cost. The constant energy it takes to remain grounded while everything around you pulls you back into the fog. Think about it. Every conversation becomes an act of translation. You notice the subtext behind people's words. You feel when someone is projecting their wound onto you. You sense unspoken tension in the room before anyone says a word. And while others may float through life oblivious, you are constantly filtering, managing, holding space for yourself and often for others. This is sacred work, but it is also draining. Especially after 35, many people report a strange shift. Once they begin healing and waking up, their body becomes more sensitive. Noise feels louder, crowds feel heavier. Conflict, once exhilarating or addicting, now feels like a direct assault. The nervous system is no longer willing to be your emotional garbage bin. It revolts in the form of fatigue, burnout, anxiety, mysterious body pain, and the only thing that begins to bring peace is space. Not just physical space, but energetic space. Quiet mornings, slower routines, simpler conversations, environments where your nervous system is not on constant high alert. You begin gravitating toward nature, deep one-on-one talks, and music that soothes instead of stimulates. And, most importantly, people who do not drain you just by being near you. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires withdrawing from the collective noise, because only in silence can the self be heard. Only in rest can the soul integrate, and only in peace can the nervous system repair what the chaos has frayed. So you stop explaining your sensitivity. You stop apologizing for needing to cancel plans. You begin honoring your own rhythm instead of performing normalcy. You realize this isn't weakness, it's wisdom. What if your sensitivity isn't a flaw, but an inner compass pointing you toward a new kind of life? A life where your nervous system is no longer bracing for the next emotional storm, but settling into a steady, gentle calm. Let's reflect. Where does your body tighten most in social spaces? What happens when you listen to your fatigue rather than fight it? And could it be that the problem is not your body at all, but the environment you've outgrown? You're not falling apart. You're awakening to the cost of staying in misaligned spaces. The healing begins not when you push through, but when you finally let go. At first, it's subtle. You smile in rooms that make your stomach tighten. You nod in conversations that drain you. You perform small talk when your soul aches for truth. You keep showing up to roles, titles, and identities that once felt safe, maybe even admirable, but now feel like you're slowly vanishing inside them. And then one day, without warning, your body flinches at the thought of another meeting, another dinner, another performance. Something cracks. You can't pretend anymore. This is not burnout. This is the awakening of the self. Carl Jung taught that the persona is the mask we present to the world, a social self that helps us function, fit in, and be accepted. It is not inherently false, but it becomes dangerous when we mistake the mask for who we are. The deeper we fall into the persona, the further we drift from the soul. And one day, the authentic self stirs beneath the surface. It whispers, then aches, then demands to be known. That is when the mask begins to feel unbearable. For many people over 35, this eruption often comes during life transitions, divorce, loss, career changes, and children leaving home. The roles that once defined you suddenly feel hollow. The words you speak begin to echo. The job you mastered becomes a cage. You start craving solitude, not because you hate people, but because yourself is finally trying to speak, and the noise of performance drowns it out. One woman I worked with, a successful executive and mother of 3, said she used to thrive in meetings. But one morning, she sat in her car outside the office and wept without knowing why. "I feel like I'm lying every day," she said. "Not to others, but to myself." She hadn't changed. Her consciousness had. The mask had simply lost its glue, and what awaited beneath was not failure, but freedom. Jung himself withdrew from public life after his spiritual breakdown. He stopped teaching, publishing, and even seeing patients for a time. Not because he lost his way, but because he had found something deeper. He retreated into himself, into the images of his unconscious, into his famous Red Book, where he met his own shadows and symbols. He let the false layers fall, and from that inner silence, something eternal emerged. So if you feel like disappearing, you're not broken, you're not lost. You're simply touching something so real inside of you that it no longer fits inside performance. You are not abandoning your life, you are beginning to live it. What would happen if you allowed the mask to fall? What would you hear in the silence it leaves behind? And if you followed the voice beneath the persona, where might it lead you? The answer is not to fix the mask, it is to meet the self, to retreat like the hermit, not in despair, but in devotion to something truer than applause. Let the old identities dissolve. They served their time. Now the soul is ready to speak. Will you listen? What if your deepest healing does not happen in the presence of others, but in the quiet rooms no one sees? There comes a point on the path of awakening when the soul stops craving approval, recognition, or even understanding, not because it has grown bitter, but because it has begun to bloom inward. This is what Jung called the hermit phase, a symbolic withdrawal that is not rooted in resentment, but in reverence. When the self has been touched and the mask begins to fall, solitude becomes not a punishment but a sanctuary. It is not exile, it is an initiation. In today's hyper-connected world, stepping back can feel counterintuitive, even alarming. We are conditioned to equate social engagement with worth, to fear missing out, to stay plugged in at all costs. But something powerful happens when a person chooses sacred distance, not to vanish from life, but to reconnect with it from within. This is often the phase when people stop posting, stop explaining, stop forcing conversations that no longer nourish. The external world may interpret it as withdrawal or depression. But internally, something holy is happening. The nervous system begins to repair itself. Emotions once buried rise to the surface like old letters needing to be read. Patterns become visible without the noise of constant mirroring. The shadow begins to speak, and this time, you're finally quiet enough to hear it. Carl Jung himself experienced this after his break with Freud. Rather than defend himself or chase new alliances, he turned inward. He spent years in solitude, engaging in what he called active imagination, a process of dialoguing with inner images, symbols, and archetypes. It was during this hermit phase that Jung's greatest insights emerged. The Red Book, his most mystical and raw text, came not from applause or approval, but from silence. In modern life, this phase may look like a man who takes long walks alone after a divorce, not to escape love, but to rediscover what love is. Or a woman in midlife who turns off her phone for weeks, sits by the ocean, and writes pages no one will ever see. Or someone who gently drifts from old friend groups, not because of conflict, but because they can no longer pretend. They are not hiding, they are healing. The hermit does not disappear out of weakness. He disappears because the noise of the world drowns the whispers of the soul. And when those whispers become more important than likes, invitations, or social scripts, one steps back, not out of arrogance, but out of deep listening. So let me ask you this. Have you mistaken your need for solitude as a flaw to be fixed instead of a sacred sign of your evolution? Have you judged your silence, your inwardness, your stillness, when in fact they may be the first signs that your self is emerging? This phase is not forever, but it is necessary, like the cocoon before the wings, like the cave before the revelation. Let yourself vanish from who you were. In the darkness, your true shape will remember itself. Let the world misunderstand. You are not here to be seen, you are here to see, and the vision begins inside. What if your return to the world is not meant to be loud, but luminous? After the storm of awakening, after the solitude and silence where the soul reassembled itself, many people wonder if they are meant to go back to who they were. The answer is no. You do not return to the center to be seen again. You return to the edges to serve differently. Just like Jung described in his mythic journey of individuation, the self does not rise to take a throne, but to become a quiet torch in the dark for others still walking blind. Your re-entry into life is not a performance. It is a blessing. And you bring gifts. At this stage, many who've gone through deep inner work no longer resonate with the frantic pace of social life. They are not interested in popularity, status, or even being understood by the majority. Instead, they are drawn to simplicity, nature, meaningful work, and real presence. They may downsize, relocate, shift careers, or disappear from old social circles, not to escape life, but to re-enter it with reverence. This return looks different for each person. It could be a once burned-out executive who now teaches mindfulness to children in her community. It could be a man who, after a near-death experience, walks away from corporate ambition to open a quiet retreat center near the mountains. Or someone who simply shows up differently in their family, no longer reactive, no longer chasing approval, quietly becoming a healing presence among people who don't even know what changed. Carl Jung believed that the awakened individual doesn't go back to sleep, nor do they try to wake the world by shouting. Instead, they plant seeds in quiet places. He wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. And once you awaken, the way you participate in life transforms. Your very presence becomes a message. You speak less, but your silence carries weight. You no longer need to prove anything. You embody it." What we often overlook is that the edges, the margins of society, are where revolutions begin. Not from the stages or the spotlights, but from the subtle shifts happening in quiet corners. From the gentle touch of someone who has transmuted pain into wisdom. From the seemingly ordinary person whose energy brings peace into a room. These are the new leaders, invisible to the masses, invaluable to the few who are ready. So I invite you to reflect. What have you been carrying through your healing that now longs to be shared? What truth have you earned that no longer needs to be spoken, only lived? Are you resisting re-entering life because you expect it to look the same? When, in fact, the return is never about fitting back in, but living from the inside out? This return does not require fanfare, just presence, just truth, just the quiet ripple of someone who has died to the false self and risen in authenticity. These are the gifts the world needs most, not performance, but peace, not noise, but resonance, not charisma, but coherence. You do not need to be everywhere. You only need to be where it matters. One moment of your embodied truth can shift a lifetime in someone else's path. So go gently, go slowly, but go. You have been transformed for a reason, and the world needs your presence more than your explanation. What if the moment you thought you were breaking was actually the moment you were being built? There is a sacred intelligence in the rhythm of withdrawal, transformation, and return. It may feel at first like you're disappearing, like life has pushed you into exile, like your voice no longer belongs in the places you once called home. But according to Jungian psychology, this retreat is not a collapse, it is gestation. The self calls you inward when the outer world can no longer nourish your becoming. You are not escaping, you are preparing. In truth, most people resist this cycle. They fear what solitude will reveal. They fear becoming irrelevant. They fear not being seen. But in this world overloaded with noise, withdrawing is not a failure. It is a radical act of self-responsibility. It is stepping outside the unconscious current of mass projection, consumer programming, and psychic entanglement to hear something quieter, something older, something true, and only in that silence can the real voice be born. Transformation cannot happen in the same environment that caused your fragmentation. Just as the caterpillar cannot become the butterfly while clinging to the branch, we too must enter the cocoon of solitude to dissolve what we were. This metamorphosis is disorienting. The identity collapses, the ego screams. But slowly, something new emerges, rooted not in reaction, but in essence. Carl Jung called this the individuation process, the sacred unfolding of the true self. And when you return, you do not return to resume the old story. You return with a different frequency. You return with eyes that see beneath the surface, a heart that no longer chases validation, and hands that carry wisdom shaped by fire. You speak less, but mean more. You no longer argue, you simply align. This is the clarity that comes after the storm, the ability to discern what is yours to carry and what was always noise. This return may look quiet on the outside, but internally it is profound. You begin to create new structures, inner and outer, that reflect who you've become. You may change how you work, how you love, how you give, how you rest. You choose differently. You offer what you've gathered not to impress, but to serve. And perhaps most powerfully, you no longer rush to convince those who are not ready. You understand that truth speaks clearest in stillness. So, if you find yourself in a season of disconnection, do not panic. You are not lost. You are being called deeper. The world you left will still be there, but you will no longer need it to define you. You are building something the collective cannot yet name, but will one day seek. And when they are ready, your presence will be a map. Your path will be a lantern. This is your work now, to stay faithful to the rhythm, to honor the silence, to trust the unseen. Withdraw, transform, return, not to be understood, but to understand, not to dominate, but to embody, not to shine, but to illuminate. Because the world does not need more noise, it needs those who have touched the soul of silence and come back with medicine. And that, perhaps, is you. Right now, quietly becoming, powerfully re-entering, gently building what only the awakened can offer. So ask yourself, what have I seen in the dark that I must now carry into the light? And can I trust that even without applause, my truth is already echoing where it is meant to be heard? If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.